So I'm not going to read all of that out. I'll let you read that for a second. So we're all fairly well aware, a lot of regulation going on. We've been waiting a long time. Certainly anybody who's been involved with the IoTSF will know, it's been a 9-10 year journey. But before we dive into all of them, this was a brief last minute slot on PSTI, so particularly obviously of interest for those involved in marketing product in the UK. The UK government has sought an engagement with industry, and they are looking for feedback on the PSTI regulations. It's still at its early stages, and in fact RSM are leading this, and I've literally in the last kind of couple of minutes been led to believe that engagement's going to happen probably over the next 12 months. But really the major point here being that the IoTSF has been included in that engagement, and as much as anything else, this is probably, as it were, an early call to arms in that we're being given the opportunity to provide feedback on PSTI. Like most pieces of legislation, there are always complexities, there are always, as it were, wrinkles that go with them, but this is a great opportunity for us to be able to feedback and hopefully improve, or at least we'd like to think improve, what's involved with PSTI and to perhaps make it easier to engage with, because whilst the 3 provisions in it are relatively simple, there's certainly been some question marks around scope. So, got a whole bunch of them. RED, CRA, NIS2, NIST itself with their CS2. The regulations are coming thick and fast. So the obvious question, and really some of the nub of this session, is how do we actually start to deal with all of these? The timeline's fairly self-explanatory. But as I know I'm singing to the choir here, certainly all the folks in this room will be familiar with the idea that if standards are going to be here in 2 years' time, and compliance is going to be expected in 2 years' time, then this represents quite a massive challenge to any product manufacturer, certainly anyone that's involved in hardware, when most hardware life cycles are at least a year, and often in some cases 2 or 3 years. So in that respect, the obvious question is what to do now, because the idea that anybody's going to wait for standards to emerge virtually at the time when compliance is required is clearly woefully optimistic and just sets up an unrealistic expectation. Briefly, NIS2 doesn't get talked about too much, but it's quite a big expansion from the traditional areas. And one of the reasons I raise this one is probably because quite a lot of product manufacturers in the room are probably thinking, NIS2? Where does that fit in? But it's rather like the UK Telecom Act in that whilst product manufacturers don't directly have to comply with it, they may well start to see their customers, particularly operational customers, starting to place requirements on them as a result of the obligations of those service providers having to comply with NIS2. So, just to wind back for a little bit before we get too buried in regulation, the obvious question is, well, what does increased security mean? Higher security? Products that are secure? And ironically, and I've been asked this question a few times, and often, particularly in security circles, there's this idea that we all know that actually making products completely secure is effectively an impossible ask. But on the other hand, there is still a lot of people who are, and you see this certainly in some of the technical discussions, there's a real emphasis purely on security. And it's often too easy to lose sight of what are you actually selling with increased security, if we looked at it in a cyber sense. But if you translate it back to, as it were, to traditional security products, the obvious question is, so if I'm a safe manufacturer, yeah, okay, I'm selling security. Clearly I want things that go in the safe not to get either looked at or stolen. But does a safe manufacturer say, it's totally impregnable, nobody will ever break into it? No, of course not. What they're actually selling is time. Most safe manufacturers will certainly not tell you that you can't get into the safe. What they probably will warrant you is how long it might take somebody to get in there. And I raise this because, to me, this is something that's really crucial when you start to look at some of the regulatory elements, is obviously, particularly if you're trying to pitch this to an executive, is we've got to do security. And usually, if my experience is anything to go by, not too dissimilar to anybody else's, unfortunately, security tends to come with compliance. And compliance in most organisations tends to be the necessary evil. It's the one that keeps the executive out of jail, and it as it were, keeps at least the senior execs hopefully fairly able to sleep at night. But that's always, if you like, it's a distress sale. It's a hard thing to push with most executives. And so my thought provoker, at least for the regulatory session, is, and having seen quite a few organisations where they're starting, they're seeing CRA, they're seeing red, and they're viewing it as a compliance issue. And that becomes a hard thing to do. So I would put it to people as a mindset change, and I touched on this in the session this morning. If you start to talk, and there was a separate session that talked about possibly communicating it via insurance, but starting to move the discussion onto what are you actually trying to protect? And in most organisations, it's revenue. Now, whether that's top line, you get damaged sales if your product has been in some way, as it were, hacked in the field, but you've also got operational cost. If you look at almost all of the regulatory now, there is an onus. Patches have to be delivered. Patches cost money. Now, whether you've got a small fleet or a large fleet and how those patches get delivered, if you start to look at the frequency of patching, and we don't see it reducing anytime soon, then if you start to put that into the context of working with an executive team, of saying, we're looking to do this because we're looking to reduce operational cost, or we're looking to protect revenue, I would put it to you that that might be a slightly easier engagement than simply turning up and saying, we've got more regulation to comply with. So the inevitable question, back on frameworks again, apologies for that one, can they help? And again, I think obviously there's been various discussion about the framework today, and we've done various bits of mapping. I'll skim through some of these. But one of the big changes we're trying to do, as I would imagine everybody's got the message today, which is making the IoTSF framework a lot more accessible, because one of the goals for the foundation is to try and reduce the cost of compliance, or at least for pre-compliance, so that organisations can actually start getting their products, their organisations and their processes ready, so they're not waiting for that standardisation. And one of the inevitable questions might be, well, okay, but the framework's not a standard. No, it isn't. But we have already done various assessments in the past, both against EN 303645 and NIST 8259, and there are further ones in the works. I won't steal Ian's thunder on that one. But the whole idea being that the framework is there to lower the cost of pre-compliance for companies, because the goal going forwards is, if you meet the requirements in the framework, I'd certainly not be brave enough to say you'd be able to meet all of the regulations, but the aim being Pareto. It'll take you a very, very long way. Let's get that one. It's very much a desktop exercise. This has never but not been formally published, but obviously EN 18031 to do with RED came out this summer, and we have done, albeit it's a very quick desktop exercise. I touched on it last year, and the short answer is, if you'd followed the framework, I won't obviously do these in detail, but if you'd followed the framework, there are controls in the framework that cover all of the requirements in EN 18031. So clearly, the aim is very much that we will be in a position to do the same with CRA. Obviously, we can never predict all the things that might come out of the standardisation work. It's exceedingly broad and there's a lot of standards. But again, the aim being it takes you a long way. I'm mindful we've got some great speakers lined up. I'm going to say no more, but at this point I'm going to introduce, talking of regulation, Simon Dunkley. Simon.